What I'd like to do next is start discussing the components in Android. So what I've given you so far has been an overview of Android from sort of a layer cake point of view, where we talked first about the operating system and some of the abstractions it provides, like processes, threads, memory management, and so on. Then we talked about the hardware abstraction layer. I explained how that was used to provide user-level libraries to provide common interfaces to cool mobile services like touchscreen or things like cameras and radios and things like that. Then we talked about the Java virtual machine layer and the Java class libraries and other parts of the so-called Android runtime, including concurrency frameworks. We then talked about the Android application framework layer and finally the packaged applications. And not surprisingly, the applications you develop, in this course at least, would live side by side with the packaged applications. In fact, as you'll see, you'll use some of the packaged applications to do your thing. Okay, so that's kind of a layer cake view of things. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a different perspective on the key elements that go into developing applications in Android. And the first thing we're going to do is talk about something called intents. But before we do that, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the 5 main components in Android. So this is what we would consider to be the components in Android's software architecture. Again, as we go through all this stuff, where it makes sense, I'll point out how these components are used in the context of concurrency and communication. Be aware, by the way, if you were to take just a generic Android programming class, we'd spend probably the bulk of the time on how to do the user-facing user interface portions of Android. We're going to cover a little bit of that, but our focus is not really on that per se, just because you can get that information almost anywhere, whereas what we're going to cover is a little bit more specialized and more suitable for Vanderbilt type of course. So the first interesting component that we'll talk about, and you'll get lots of experience programming with assignment number 3, are things called activities, or activity, if there's just one of them. And an activity is typically, though it doesn't have to be, a user-facing component that does something that interacts with the user. Now that's a little bit of a misnomer because there are ways to use activities that don't involve direct access with the user, and you're going to get a chance to program one of them in your assignment. But the most common uses of activities are to interact with the user, and you'll get practice with that too. So for example, one thing that you'll do, and one of the first things you'll do with the activity that you'll start programming now with assignment 3 is you'll basically find a way to get the user to provide a URL. And that, of course, is a user-facing operation, and to do that you'll use things like a text view and an edit text and so on in order to prompt the user and get the result. So that's an example of something that an activity can do. And once you have that information, then you can process it and sort of set a whole bunch of other things in motion that we'll talk about later. So an activity is basically a way to represent a single screen with a user interface. Usually, it doesn't have to be, but that's the most common thing. If you want to learn more about activities, we will cover activities in great detail, probably starting next time at the rate we're going here. We'll cover them in class. If for some reason you want to start watching a little bit of stuff ahead of time, or you just want a different view of what activities are, if you go here to this course, which you can register for, the course is all the course, really what we want here is the course material, not the rest of the course. There's a set of lectures in week 2 from this course that talk about Android activities. And it's by a colleague and a friend of mine named Adam Porter, who's a professor at University of Maryland. So it's a good place to go to get a little bit more background. We'll cover this stuff, but if you want to watch ahead, you're welcome to. The next type of component we're going to cover, and we'll cover this a little bit later, we'll probably cover this in a couple weeks, is called a service. And a service can be used to run in the background to perform long-running operations, which typically access remote resources. So an example of a remote resource, of course, would be something like a file or an image on a server in the cloud, or a database, or a web service, or whatever, right? And you'll get some chances to play around with services by the time the class is done as well. There'll be a whole module on this later in the course. There's also something called broadcast receivers, which are basically ways of being notified when interesting things occur. We're actually going to talk about them here in just a minute. The best way to think about broadcast receivers is to think about the publish-subscribe paradigm, or notification engines, where you register to receive notifications when something happens that you're interested in, and then those notifications are pushed to you when something happens that you're interested in. And so those are broadcast receivers. We'll talk a bunch about them. They're basically ways of responding to system-wide announcements. A simple example would be on your phone, when you start to run low on battery power, then the system will detect this and it will send out a notification that says battery low. And you, if you're interested in such an event, can subscribe to the battery low event and then display that to the user somehow. For example, the phone app on an Android phone subscribes to the battery low intent or event, and if you're in the middle of a phone call and you're running out of battery, then it'll beep at you and alert you to that. Did anybody watch the Super Bowl commercials last night where God runs low on batteries, right? And he gets all pissed off and starts destroying the earth and stuff like that. By the way, the Super Bowl advertisements were very disappointing this year. I don't know if anybody watched them, but they were really boring and very depressing in some cases. My favorite depressing ad was the one about Nationwide with a little boy like doesn't live to do all these things, and somebody posted this thing that said, I would have handed off to Marshawn Lynch, but I died. So you probably would have too. Something else we're going to talk about, content providers, which are basically means of accessing persistent data. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the course. Very powerful way to access things like contacts or calendar entries or email or SMS messages, MMS messages, and so on and so forth. And there'll be a whole module on this. And then the last thing, which we're going to cover next, are these things called intents. And they're basically data structures that are used to glue many of these other components together. And it's remarkably cool stuff. Once again, I'm going to cover intents here in just a minute. But if you want another perspective on intents, you can go and watch my colleague Adam, and he has some lectures on intents as well. All right, so those are the 5 key things. And it would not be too unusual to ask a quiz question like, name 3 of the 5 Android components or something like that. So it's good at least to know enough to regurgitate back those things, because you'll get a chance to learn a lot more about them as we go through the class. All right, so let's start by talking about Android intents, which are really the basic building blocks of a lot of other stuff. And this is one of the most interesting and, for my money, unique and distinguishing features of Android that set it apart from a lot of other component-based programming environments like iOS and so on. So an intent is basically a so-called passive data structure. Does anybody know what the heck that means? What does it mean to be a passive data structure? So what it basically means is that it's a data structure with a bunch of fields, most of which are accessible through setters and getters, but there are really no higher level methods that do computations on these things. It's just a place to pack a bunch of data. And here are some of the things that you can pack into an intent: name, action, data, category, extras, and flags. And we'll talk about what all those different things are. There are 2 different types of things that an intent can describe. An intent can describe an action or an operation that somebody wants performed, like view this link, for example, or pick this contact, or download this file, right? Those are examples of actions that you want to have somebody perform. That's one set of things you can do with an intent. And the second thing you can do with an intent is alert one or more other components that an event has occurred, like battery voltage low, right? So those are the 2 main things. And it's important to remember that there are these 2 different classes of things, because the different types of components in Android work slightly differently, whether something's an action to perform or a report of an event that's occurred. Now, why is this so cool? It's cool because intents enable late runtime binding between code written by different applications. And you will get first-hand experience playing around with this in assignment number 3. So this discussion will be abstract for a day or 2 until you look at the assignment and start playing around with it. And you're then going to be like, wow, this is really cool. And so what you can do is you can describe your implementations in the form of activities or other components like services or whatnot. You can write these things up. You can package them as sort of reusable binary elements of computation, if you will. And then you can wire these things together in a very late binding way by connecting the intents that you send out with activities or other components like services that are going to handle those intents. And this whole thing is very late binding. So when you write the code and you throw it into the system to do something for you, you often don't know when you throw the request for service into the system who or what will respond. And it's up to the Android frameworks, like the activity manager that we talked about before, to figure out which of the various existing components in the system are able to handle your requests. And sometimes there's more than one, and you actually have to disambiguate which one you want. If you watch the video I made, you'll see an example of that. So basically, there are these filters that sit between the intents and the things that actually get done, and they figure out who actually gets to do the work. And it's all really cool and late binding. Late binding just means you don't have to prematurely commit yourself to one implementation for something. Now, why is that useful? Why the heck is it useful to do late binding things? What's the utility or what's the benefit that we get from that? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Yeah. So you're not prematurely committing yourself to one implementation. You might start out by having one type of movie viewer. And then if somebody comes along with a better type of movie viewer, you could go ahead and add that new type of movie viewer or a slightly different way of doing the movie viewing into the system. And the applications that already exist won't have to know that you've got a new way of doing things until they run, at which point you'll get to choose which one is best. So it gives people flexibility in a way that's transparent and easily extensible. So those are the benefits that come from this loose coupling. You'll learn more about that as we go along. So intents provide the glue between loosely coupled components. So components can be written largely in isolation from each other, and then you can come along later and glue them together, and intents are the way that they get glued together. And once again, if this will undoubtedly seem abstract at the moment, and I'll show you some examples, but once you start to play around with this for the homework assignment, it'll become much, much more clear. An intent is sent by one component and received by 0 or more components. And we'll talk about the whole intent resolution process as we go through these slides. But that's a key theme, intent resolution, figuring out who is going to handle this intent and how is that matching done. And Android does a lot of this for you under the hood. Now keep in mind that the components that handle the intents can run in the same process, or they can run in different processes. And it's typically, not always, but typically a configuration time decision about what gets to run where. So what that means is that you can make a late binding decision as to whether the component that handles the intent, the request for service, runs in the same address space as the sender or in a different address space. And going back to the earlier point the gentleman made about robustness, this is a great example of how you can make systems more robust by being able to run certain things in other processes where if something goes awry, it doesn't damage your application code. So there are three basic classes of components that can get started by intents. So one of them is the activity, and the way in which you start up activities with an intent is to use start activity and start activity for result. And both of those methods will be used in programming assignment number 3. So you will become well versed with starting activities and starting activities with result. The only difference between start activity and starting activity with result is that start activity launches an activity and doesn't expect a result, although there could be ways of passing results back, which we'll talk about later. Conversely, start activity with result expects the activity that started to compute something and send a result back. And you'll get a chance to learn how to do that. It's really very simple to do, but it requires knowledge of a few moving parts. Another thing you can start with an intent is a service. And there's a couple of different ways you can do this. You can either do it with something called start service or bind service. When you call start service, that typically starts up a service, and that service will continue to run as long as it wants to keep running. It may decide to shut itself down after it handles the request. It may keep itself alive. It's up to the service to decide what to do. Conversely, bind service establishes a so-called bound service, where the service implementation and one or more clients collaborate with each other, and as long as there are clients with bindings to the service remains alive. And when the final client unbinds itself to the service automatically shuts itself down. So we'll talk about those things. We'll show you some examples, different ways of running things in the background. And then the third and final way of starting components with activities are to send broadcast intents. So these two examples are examples of places where you send an intent that's an action to perform. Start an activity or start a service. And that's a specific thing that's going to get run. In contrast, broadcast receivers and broadcast intents are events that have occurred that you want to notify others about in the system. And there's often an opportunity to have 0 or more components that are broadcast receivers that receive a broadcast intent. So you may actually have multiple receivers. For example, there may be multiple applications on your phone that want to be notified when the battery is going low. And so there may be multiple things that are registered for that. And we'll talk about examples of those. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the various things. So in your next assignment, you'll get a chance to play around with start activity and start activity for result. And then we'll probably also cover a few of the other ones as we go through the course. Let's talk about the intent structure. So remember I told you before, an intent's a passive data structure, and it's got a lot of fields in it, and those fields are accessed typically through setter and getter methods. And there's a bunch of things that it provides. Just using a running example we'll have here. Here we have a battery service, which is going to keep track of the physical power level of the battery on the phone. And we'll have this thing called an activity manager service, but these are both things that are provided by Android and its system services. And when the battery changes, either goes from acceptable to low or low to acceptable, a battery power intent is sent, and various parts of the phone can register to receive those intents, like the phone app or system server and so on. They can receive those intents and notify you somehow that things have changed. So there's a bunch of different information that are available here, and we're going to talk about them very briefly, and we'll talk about them in more detail. So some of the things that you can have is an action and data. So the actions are the things that you're either asking to perform or notifying people about. So battery voltage low would be an event that's an action that you're notifying about. View or pick or edit or search are examples of actions you want someone to perform on your behalf. So those would be actions. And data, of course, is the information that you want those actions to do something on. So it's basically, do something and what you want it done on. So the do something is sort of a verb, and the thing that you want it done on is a noun or an object or something like that. So in the case where you want to, let's say the action is dial, then the data would be a phone number, right? So dial a phone number. And notice that by doing it this way, you don't say, I want this activity to run and dial a phone. All you say is, I want the phone dialed. You figure out how to do it, Android, and Android figures out how to handle that. Other examples, you say, edit this document, where the document is given as a path name to a file that's running on the system. So once again, the action is edit, and the data is the document ID that you want to edit. And there's lots of other things along those lines. So those are some of the things that go into an intent. There's also some stuff that's of interest to the Android system. So this is not, actually Android's interested in a lot of this stuff, but some things the applications are also interested in, some things the Android system is interested in. Examples would be category and flags. Category gives additional information the system uses to figure out how to handle the intent. So it might be, is this intent something that can be launched? Is it an activity that's an application that we can launch from, say, the home screen, or an application? Or is it browsable? Those are some of the examples of categories. Then there are various kinds of flags you can use for debugging purposes, we'll see. All this information that we see here provides an extensible domain-specific language that allows users to express what they want done, but not how to do it. And this is really, really, really important. And this is at the heart of what makes Android so powerful. So here are some examples of these kinds of things. So display a street address. You say, you know, and you'll actually see an example of this next time, probably, where you give it an address, and it goes ahead and brings up the Maps application, and it displays the address. Send an email. You want to send an email, so it'll start the email send. Browse a URL. You give it a URL, and it goes ahead and opens up the page. Call John Smith's cell. We'll look at an application that works along those lines, where you can basically pick the user or pick the address from the contacts list, and that is all done automatically. And then you get back the result, and then you can launch a Maps app or launch the dialer to do these things automatically. So there's lots of really cool things that you can do. And notice that this doesn't say how it gets done. This doesn't say who does it. It just says, here's what I want to have done. And that's a declarative form that's very powerful. So the focus is on the what, not the how. The API for intent is vast, right? So if you were to take a look at the source code, or just even look at the documentation, you'll see it just goes on and on and on. And mostly it's setter and getter fields that access all of these various things. By the way, does anybody know what that is? What is it? Yes, but what is it? It's the Argonath. Come on, you guys, you got to pick up. Everybody knows that. If you watch the Fellowship of the Ring movie, that appears in the very last half hour, where they're sailing down the river being chased by Uruk-hai, and they come out and they see these two giant figures out here like this. And Aragorn, who's in the boat, basically says that these are my ancestors. Does anybody know who these people are? What's that? Kings of the North Kingdom. Yes, they're kings. So I think it is Isildur and I can't remember the other one, but the book and the movie have them slightly differently. For sake of argument, we'll say it's Isildur and Elendil. How about that? If anybody can argue with that, I don't think that's actually quite right, but it's close. Those were Aragorn's ancestors. Largely consists of accessor and mutator methods for its fields. So let's talk a little bit about these different things. Now, this is something interesting you can do with intents. So one of the fields you can give to an intent, if you so choose, is to give it the name of the component you want to run the stuff. That's not the most common way to do it, but it's a possible thing you can do. It's optional. The reason it's optional is because we don't want to say what to do. We don't want to say, go get this particular application to run this thing. We want to be able to be more general. We're going to say, give me something that will edit a file. Give me something that will download a file. That's more abstract, right? But you can give a name. If the name is explicit, then the intent is delivered to an instance of that class. So that way you're kind of hard coding it. And that's certainly doable, and I do that a lot when I'm testing my applications, but it's not really the preferred way of doing things in Android. Here's an example of how you can use so-called explicit intents. You make yourself a new intent, and then you can set the name or even the class that you want to have run this thing. And that's, again, it's kind of a hard-coded way to do things, but it's legal. Or you can also do code that looks like that. You would typically use explicit intents to pass messages between components in the same application. So if there's a fairly tight coupling, if you're breaking up your components into pieces just because they're more modular, then explicitly naming them is fine. But as we'll see, it's more preferable to use implicit intents. If the name is implicit, other information is used to locate a suitable target. And this is magic. This is just absolutely the coolest thing you've ever seen once you start to play around with it. The things that you use to indicate how to find which one to run are the action, the data type, and the category. And the action and the data type are by far the most common things that you use. Implicit intents are often used to activate components that run in other applications. So, for example, for your assignment number 3, you will get a chance to use implicit intents. In one case, the activity that you develop is part of your application, but we do it within implicit intent just to make it clear how it works. In another case, the activity that you're going to be using is not part of your application at all. In fact, it comes out of the gallery application. It's used to display a path name to a file that you've downloaded from the internet. And so you didn't write that piece of code. It's something that comes bundled as a packaged application by Android. And all you need to do is figure out how to tell Android to get that thing to go ahead and view the image you downloaded. So that's a really good example of using implicit intents. And we'll see how that gets used in assignment 3. The action determines how the rest of the intent is structured. It's kind of the verb. It's the thing that's going to do the work. The data and the extra fields are what the action is going to influence. You can think of actions as being generic methods, right? So it's kind of like you had a method called, view or edit or choose or download or dial or whatever, right? But rather than having to hard code a whole gazillion pile of methods, instead we just have a name that's a string that's the action that we're going to have. And you'll see how those things get used. So here are some examples. If you take a look at the intent class in Android, you'll see that there are these constants defined in there. That's why I said the API is vast. It's huge. And there's a constant called action call, action edit, action battery low, action headset plug. And those are the constants. And these are the types of components that they target. So action call will initiate a phone call on an activity that's part of the phone service, telephony service. Action edit will go ahead and call an activity to display data for the user to edit. So you can edit things. We talked about broadcast receivers. Action battery low is used to send out an event warning the battery is getting low. Action headset plug says someone's plugged the headset into or out of the device, and so on. So you can write code that responds when those things occur, or someone else can write that code for you. Okay, action names are typically specific, but they're not so specific as to be only usable in one context, right? So dial is a good example. I mean, dial is not as generic as do something, right? But it's not as specific as call John Smith's cell phone, right? That would be too specific. So dial is a good compromise between saying something that's too specific versus something that's so vague as to be unusable. So when you say dial, that's the action, and then you have to provide some other information along there as well. So here are some examples. So we make a new intent that says I want to be able to view something, and you can either do it like this, or you can make a new intent and then set the action view action. Those are both really the same thing. And what you typically want to do is define these protocols, and you'll get a chance to play around with this for the next assignment, where you specify actions, either using ones that come out of the box from default or you make your own. So here are some of the ones that come out of the box from Android. So create, view, pick, edit, web search, and so on. And you'll actually get to use action view and action web search for assignment number 3. So you get a chance to play around with those things. Okay, so if that's the actions, if that's the things to be done, then you also have to have the data, which are the things to do the actions on. And again, this all sounds very abstract at first, but once you start looking at this, it's very obvious what's going on, because there's really not other ways to do it. So data is typically something called a URI. Does anybody know what URI stands for? Yes, it's a Uniform Resource Indicator or identifier. Or it's the University of Rhode Island, which is often voted #1 party school in the country. But
is there ways to transfer data across classes? Because you don't want to transfer copy the data. You want to put it somewhere where you can access.
Okay, so that's a great question. The question was, how does data get sent back and forth between processes? There's lots and lots of different ways to do it. They all involve, one way or another under the hood, using something called the Android binder framework, which is how communication takes place across processes in Android. The most typical thing you do, not always, but typical, you often put the data into something called a content provider, where it's typically stored in some kind of SQLite database, and then you send URIs to that data around the system, which are basically kind of like little URLs that refer into the file system of the local Android device, of the phone. And then when a receiver gets one of these things, it can do an operation to go and read or write to that data. And in fact, your assignment number 3 has you do exactly that. So what you'll end up doing is you write an activity called the download image activity, and download image will take a URL to a remote file, an image out in the internet somewhere, and it will go ahead and download the contents of that image, store it locally into the file system, and then it'll return the URI to that file back to the calling activity, and that URI will then be used to launch the gallery application to view that image. And that's getting ahead of myself a little bit, but if you watch the video, you'll see that that's what it's doing. Yes, Jonathan?
For the names, is it using a string for that, or a location?
These are strings, yeah.
So what stops me from writing an application and naming it something like Facebook? And so if you want to post something to Facebook,
Nothing stops you from doing that, other than there are typically permissions that you have to agree to when you download and install an application. And so, and that also, I guess the politically correct way to say it is, those kinds of things should be mediated by the Play Store, which is basically Google's iTunes. And so, they, at least in theory, control how people register the names of their applications. And so if you call it Facebook and then you try to register it with the Play Store, somebody will yell at you and say you can't do that. Now, of course, if you want to write an application called Facebook as part of this class and put it on your phone, you're welcome to do that. And whatever havoc and confusion that causes is your problem, but Google would disambiguate that at the Play Store level.
And then, so are intents what you would use to post something to Facebook using the name and then having a custom action?
Well, so keeping this in mind, that's a good question. So effectively, the intents are used to send between different Android components on the phone.
Yeah, to open up the Facebook application.
Yes.
On
Yes. Yeah. So when in fact, there's actually a launcher activity or launcher application, and so when you click on an icon, it basically uses all these mechanisms under the hood to get things up and running. So we'll look at that a little bit later. It's really cool. Okay, so the data is what is actually connected to the actions. So for example, and this is pretty obvious, if the action is action call, the data would be a telephone number, right? So here's an example where we make a new intent, which is an action call intent, and we give it some telephone number. That telephone number probably won't do anything useful, but you get the point, right? So that's the data, that's this thing that's connected with that action. And you can do it a couple different ways. You can either pass it here like this, or you can make an intent and then you can set the data as a separate call. So that's action call connected to data. Here's another example. We'll actually look at this one next time, given the rate at which we're going through this stuff. If you have action view and the data field is a geo tag, it's a geo data, that's called the authority, then that will end up opening up an app to go ahead and view this on a map. So it'll go ahead and run, say, Google Maps if you have your thing installed properly. So in this particular case, this will go and take this lat long coordinate, and it will view it by whatever means is configured into your phone to view these kinds of things. And we'll look at code that does all this stuff next time. You'll get a chance to see how it works. And these URIs basically indicate where the data is located on the device, and they're typically controlled by something called a content provider, although they don't have to be, but that's by far the most common way to do things. And a content provider is just a front end to some kind of persistent database, usually an SQLite database, but it could be a file or something else. You can also set the type, so you'll get a chance to play around with this for assignment number 3, because when you want to have the gallery application launched to view the image you downloaded, you want to tell it that this type is basically a JPEG image. And you'll see some other ways that things get done as well with this. Okay, category gives you some additional information about the action to execute. So here are some of the things. Category browsable, the activity can be invoked in a browser. Category home, these are things that are on the home screen. And category launcher, and this means it's a top-level application. So if you look at your Android phone, for example, probably be a little bit hard to see from that distance, but if you could see this, when you click on the little applications tab, it brings up all your apps, and you can scroll through it and so on. If you use an iPhone, it's the same thing. Those are examples of applications that can be launched. Okay, then there's also some things called extras, and we'll play around with some of this stuff a little bit later in the class. There's various ways to do things. Extras are where you put additional information that doesn't fall under the category of the action, the name, or the URI data. And so you can put other kinds of things. They're typically used as key value pairs. So for example, action send has an extra indicating a list of email recipients. So here you go, you say, I want to make a new intent called action send, and I'm going to put as an extra a bunch of email addresses, and these are the people I'm going to put in my email address. So those get added to the intent as additional fields that will be sent. And then there's also some flags, which basically say how the intent will be handled. So this is sort of low-level detail. We don't have to know this right now. I won't quiz you on this, but it says don't put the activity in the history stack or print out additional information when we're trying to resolve this intent, and that's very useful for debugging. You'll get used to using logcat with your program to tell you what the heck is going on when your program runs. And so you have to get used to putting these log statements into your code. And when you look at my example code, you'll see all this stuff. Okay,